I have a complicated relationship with Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the Game Complete Edition. And not just because that 14-syllable title is awkward to say if you're as incessantly pedantic as I am. As you may know, but in case you don't, the game was originally released in 2010 as an adaptation of the graphic novels by Brian Lee O'Malley, and as a tie-in to the 2010 film adaptation by Edgar Wright. It got pretty good reviews, but it was available exclusively for download, which didn't bode well in 2014 when the game was delisted, rendering it unplayable for the foreseeable future. People say that it was due to the Scott Pilgrim license expiring, but as far as I'm aware, there's never been any official reason given, and quite frankly, I'm struggling to imagine any official reason that wouldn't just annoy people more. I'm a big fan of the Scott Pilgrim movie.
Why wouldn't you be?
But I only became familiar with it after the game was already gone, so I never got a chance to play it. But flash forward to 2021, and a re-release gets announced for modern platforms. This was a big deal in a lot of ways. It was a re-release of a game that we thought was potentially gone forever, it was part of a franchise with a huge fan base, and it was a movie tie-in game that apparently wasn't terrible. After all that, I had to play it. I had to see what all the fuss was about. I played it for about 2 hours, couldn't get into it, and then when...
I was thinking we should break up or whatever.
Really?
You might say that 2 hours isn't enough time to make a judgment on a game, and yeah, you're exactly right, but I never said that the game was bad. I just wasn't up for continuing after a less than stellar first impression. But then recently I felt inclined to make a video about the game. I wouldn't know why. It's not as if there's any kind of upcoming Netflix anime starring the original cast of the movie that could potentially give a video about the IP a boost in the algorithm.
This info dump was inevitable.
I was hoping that after sitting down and playing the game from start to finish, it might finally click for me. And it kinda did. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's definitely things about it that I still don't like, but on the whole, I came away feeling a bit more positive about it than I did initially. To start with things I'm not exactly in lesbians over, the game basically doesn't have a story. All we get is an opening montage explaining that Scott is dating Ramona Flowers and has to defeat her 7 evil ex-boyfriends.
Exes.
And that's pretty much all the story you get until the ending. It's a little disappointing considering that the game already has some very strong source material. There's barely any interaction between characters, cutscenes are usually only a few seconds long, and half of the main cast are just relegated to background extras. The game basically expects you to have already either read the comics or seen the movie and fill in the context for yourself. Which, I have seen the movie, but that doesn't mean the game's story is any less underdeveloped.
Great story, man.
Like I said, though, the big problem I had with the game was the first impression the gameplay gave. And when I booted up the game again for the first time in 2 years, I remembered exactly why I didn't like it before. The game has a lot of really unintuitive design choices that create kind of an unfriendly learning curve, at least for me. The most prominent one for me being the controls. You have 2 movement speeds, walking by just tilting the analog stick normally, or running by either tilting quickly or double tapping depending on your settings. And it makes the movement feel really clunky and stiff. The walking speed is insanely slow and not very useful, meaning I was basically having to resort to running for most of the game. And since running requires you to move the stick in a specific way, it makes it so I have to be very deliberate with every single movement I make. There are times where the walking speed is useful, like on a narrow walkway, but they're very few and far between. What I really don't understand is why the game doesn't just use the amount you tilt the analog stick to control the movement speed. If you're using a D-pad or a keyboard, then fine, but this is part of what an analog stick is designed to do. I mean, the game was originally released for Xbox 360 and PS3. It was exclusively for platforms that have an analog stick pre-built in. There was no reason not to do this. Aside from that, there were other elements of the game design that I didn't really care for either, like the difficulty, which initially just struck me as a little too on the unforgiving side. I have nothing against a hard game, but certain elements just made me find the challenge frustrating rather than engaging. These stages are pretty long, averaging about 15 to 20 minutes with no checkpoints. You die 19 minutes into that stage, you're playing those 19 minutes again.
Ooh, the game is over too! It's over a second time! That sounds fun!
There were also attacks from enemies that I felt I wasn't given a chance to anticipate, like enemies pulling off attacks when they're knocked over despite the game usually treating enemies as stunned in that state. Or sometimes they'll enter the screen when you're at the very edge of it, so that's more damage you can't account for. The game also includes a few RPG mechanics like gaining experience points, leveling up and being able to upgrade your stats, the latter of which you do from buying items from various shops throughout the game. But the baffling thing about it is that the item descriptions don't tell you what they do until after you buy them. Like, am I missing something here? Like, I'm really struggling to imagine what possible benefit there is to designing the shops this way. I mean, in retrospect, it's not a huge deal because it's not too difficult to find something that will help you, and the game is pretty generous with cash, so you can just bulk buy the most expensive stuff and get the best results possible, but it's still a confusing interface that takes some time to get used to. These were my impressions when I first played the game in 2021, and when I started playing again, those opinions didn't exactly change right away. But if you're worried I'm not gonna geek out over this game, I'll geek. I have the capacity to geek. Especially because once I had time to settle into the game's design, things started to make a lot more sense to me. One of the main things I realized was that as much as I complained about the difficulty, it's actually a lot more manageable than it initially seems. Even though a death means you're starting the stage from scratch no matter what, any cash or upgrades you get actually carry over into repeated attempts. That means that even if you're redoing a large chunk of a stage, you're going to be much better equipped to handle it. And when you reach where you died before and see that you've still got a ton of health left, it makes that failed 19-minute attempt feel much less like a waste of time because you still earned something that helped you get that far. The combat itself has a fair amount of strategy. You're given a special attack that can be used for crowd control that is powered by a meter in the top left, which decreases the more you use it. The catch is that the points in that meter can also act as bonus health if you die during a stage, which creates some strategy in the combat. While you're fighting, you're constantly asking yourself, do I want to save these points in case I need them later, or do I want to stop the enemies that I'm currently dealing with from ganging up on me? You also automatically earn new attacks every time you level up, and it really does help to make the game feel a lot more manageable after the beginning was a little overwhelming. You could argue it doesn't make for a great first impression, but it does make leveling up feel a lot nicer. To be honest though, a few of these button presses just never really seem to work for me. Like, I press the buttons that the game gives me, but the attack just doesn't seem to go off. To an extent, I like that the game doesn't just pause for a tutorial every single time you get a new ability. It just tells you how to perform the attack and leaves you to experiment. It's a great way of keeping the pace up since the game doesn't forcibly stomp you mid-stage and gives you a fair bit more freedom to learn on your own accord. Although saying that, I wish that there was like an optional training area where I could practice attacks in a safe environment as opposed to the middle of a street fight where I have to divide my attention a lot of different ways. But aside from one or two finicky button combinations, most of the abilities you learn are actually very useful and add some depth to the combat, like this ground pound attack that makes it much easier to chain attacks between enemies, or this upgrade which allows you to swing melee weapons at a faster rate. And that can really come in handy for not giving enemies any leeway and taking down huge amounts of health. Although in more than one occasion, maybe a little too handy. And much like what the presentation would suggest, the game has a very retro approach to level design, where there aren't that many stages, but they make the game last longer by making the stages as challenging as they can. And luckily, it's the good kind of retro design where it's more based around learning the stages and developing a strategy. Although there is one retro aspect to the game that I don't care for, and that's the story, like I said.
I didn't care the first time you told me. Care even less now.
Sorry to keep beating a dead Gideon, but I feel like I'd be able to tolerate the lack of a story a lot more were it not for the fact that the game kind of fails to give context for its own gameplay. Fighting the evil X's, I can understand, but who are all these random guys that are trying to kill me? They weren't in the movie, and even if they were in the books, I wouldn't know, but it's not made clear who they are here. It might sound like a nitpick, but it is an element that was in the back of my head distracting me slightly. To make a comparison for a second, people often criticize Shigeru Miyamoto for how much he seems to hate games with stories. I'm personally really salty about how Pikmin 4 basically just treated all the previous games as non-canon. I realize that's not particularly relevant, but I just had to get that off my chest. Pikmin 4 is otherwise fucking amazing, and that's the only big problem I have with it. But at least Mario games established that the Goombas and Koopa Troopas you fight throughout the game are Bowser's minions. It's just one of those subtle implications that you normally take for granted, but they do still play a role in immersing you in the gameplay. Scott Pilgrim just doesn't have that. It's not a deal breaker, I'll smack a motherfucker if I need to, I just like to know why I'm doing it. Wait, hold on, let me check something. No, I thought there might have been an email explaining the situation that I might have just skimmed, but no. I know this may have seemed like a predominantly negative review, but just so there's no confusion, yes, I do like this game. In fact, actually sitting down and committing to play through it for this review actually did a lot of good for my opinion on it.
Well, aren't you pleased as punch?
Honestly, the reason I've chosen to focus on the negatives is really because the game is pretty to the point in terms of the actual content. What you see is kind of what you get, and there's not a lot that I can add beyond saying, yeah, it's good. I would say if the gameplay you've been watching looks at all fun to you, and especially if you like Scott Pilgrim, you're pretty likely to enjoy it. Just be prepared to persevere a little to get to grips with it.
Scott earned the power of Stuart's respect.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, then consider checking me out on Patreon, where I post previews and full releases of my videos before they get released on YouTube. Now, I've got to make like this game and leave you all. I promise I won't be gone for 7 years though.